All right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming to SQL in the City 2013. How many people were here last year? How many people were here 2 years ago? It's quite a few. Okay, good, cool. So this is our third year doing this. We're kicking it off again in London, and I'm glad to be back across the water. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Steve Jones. I run SQL Server Central. Probably a few of you have heard of the site or know me, and it's good to see everybody again. Today I'm going to talk about source control and team development a little bit. And really, we've got a few goals here where I'm not going to ask how many of you use source control because probably some of you will lie. You should all be using source control. I know there are reasons you may not be, but I want to try to convince you that's actually a good idea. Talk a little bit about some standards and practices that may make it easier for you to use source control or for you to work in a team development environment and things that might work out better, and see how that stuff goes together. So most of us work in all kinds of industries, various industries that maybe in technology, maybe not in technology, but for years my wife worked in the cellular industry, and she had a great saying that she would always bring up in intense meetings or sales meetings where she would say, "We're not saving babies." For the most part, the jobs we do, it's not that critical. We can make some mistakes. Things can be delayed a little bit. Our bosses don't want to hear that, I understand. We want to get things done, we want to be professional, but we have some room for error, and too many of us have taken advantage of that to not actually do the best job or not hold ourselves to a very, very high standard in what we do. And we see that constantly in software, right? We constantly deploy software that is broken. Microsoft does it, Redgate does it. I'm sure most of you do it. I'm not going to ask for a survey because you're not going to want to admit how poorly you deploy software sometimes. But imagine, you work in an industry where making a mistake is a big deal. You can't easily have problems or things that fall down, or you can't roll back mistakes. If I cut the wrong wire, it could be a bad day, right? Not easy to undo that thing. But since we're not in those industries, we have some room for error, but we don't want to. We want to be better at what we do. And hopefully today we can help you to be better at your jobs, help you to learn some things that make your development process smoother, make your administration smoother, that kind of thing. So I kind of want to start by, oh wow, that was bad. This is Annabelle's fault, by the way. She touched my slides, so she messed my demo up. I want to show you how easy it is to actually set up source control and to get things going. So I've got let's pop this open here. On my C drive here, I've got Subversion installed. For those of you that may have used it, it's just a free source control system. And if I look in this folder, it's essentially a database in the file system. And there's a repository that I can look at that actually was where I would control all my source control type of stuff. So let's crank up Management Studio here. I've got a folder here, essentially that's empty. And I'm going to add another one here in a moment as soon as this runs. Now, you shouldn't save your passwords. You guys know that, right? Don't want anybody to just open your machine, start using your servers, that kind of thing. So I've got a series of databases here, various ones, and I'm going to create a new one actually. And in this case, I am going to create this database that's called Simple Talk Manual. And nothing magic. I'm going to create some tables. I'm going to add some data, all the kind of stuff that we do every day. But we'll simulate this to show this is an existing application of some sort. Once this creates, you'll see that I have, in fact, a new database here. And it's got tables in it. It's got store procedures. It's got all of the stuff that we expect. Now, I've pre-done this, and I've actually gone through and scripted out this database. So if I go here, you'll see I've got, there it is. I've got tables, store procedures, things scripted. Those of you that have right-clicked on a database and chosen Generate Scripts and clicked Next and done all the default options, this is what you get. I get my schema, my object name, my type of object, that kind of thing. Okay. I did this in advance just for the sake of doing it because I wasn't sure how long it would take. I can add this here to my Subversion repository. I can say add a folder. I can pick that particular folder. Please use comments and source control. It'll add it right in. No problem. Very easy to do. Everybody with me? You guys got it? Nothing magic. Subversion is ever so slightly buggy in this client, but whoops. Let's click the right button. Refresh this. I have a manual, and all my files are here. Okay, they're checked into source control. It's that easy. It's that simple to do. I used to do this back with Visual Source Safe. We would actually script out databases or save all our files and do that. So let me check this out now. I want to check this out, and I'm going to pick a different folder. I'm going to put it somewhere where I can easily find it in Management Studio. Let's just pick this folder. Check everything out, and if I go look at that folder now, which is over here, all my files are there. This was empty. Trust me, I wouldn't lie to you. I would lie to you, but I would tell you I was lying to you. Everything's checked out. It's got the little icon that Subversion has added here, which says that now all these files are synchronized with what's in source control. They're great. Okay? If I want to edit things, if I want to make a change, I can use Management Studio. Oops, let me close this one because we don't want this one open. This is the kind of thing that I used to do, where we would say, file open. And let's go over here, and let's pick a file. For example, let's do a store procedure. It's the kind of thing you guys do every day, right? Where I say, let's add a parameter, okay? Now that doesn't work, right? Why doesn't it work? Well, I'm changing an object, so now it works. I can save this, right? No big deal. I close it. If I close it without doing it, it'll save it. If I go over to my folder, it'll now tell me, oh, this is not in sync. Right? Some of you that have used Visual Source Safe or something, maybe you're familiar with this process. I can commit this in. It'll go in sync. This will refresh. And if I were to actually look at my repository, let's close this, we'll see that I actually have a change here. Let's go by revision. You can see I've done this a few times. I've got to revision my stored procedure, and if I look at what happened, you'll see that I've got 2 entries here, right? The initial item. I can open either one of these. I can see what's going on. There's nothing very magic about that. It's very simple. If I want to add a new table, and I've actually got a script to do that. I love VMs sometimes. Because it helps if I click on the right thing at the right time, doesn't it? I can add a table here. Now, if I want to put this in source control, I'd actually have to save that file, right? I'd actually have to say, oh, well, really what I have to do is I have to take this file, and I'd have to go, I want to add this to my source control system. I'd have to give it a good name, because if I didn't, then what I'd end up with is this, things that aren't according to some standard, that aren't easily understood. And I'd have to say, well, I want to add this, and then I want to commit it. And it'll add that to my system. It'll appear here. But notice that doesn't match anything else. I'm putting a lot of burden on myself or my developers to actually follow a process that makes sense. Now, developers are smart people. I'm sure some of you are developers. Developers can be trained to do this. It takes a few months. But I worked in a startup at one point where we used Visual Source Safe probably about 15 years ago. And at the time, we didn't have anything in source control anyway, and we wanted to implement that. And it took me about 3 or 4 months to teach developers to not right-click on objects in Management Studio and say modify and make changes in the GUI and walk away and not put them in source control. Because source control was how we deployed everything. It was very important that we had everything in source control. And it just takes some time to build those habits. You can build them. Trust me, it will actually work, but it's a little bit of a hassle. And it's annoying while people are learning to do it. Let me actually do this slightly different way, because I just want to show you something. As John mentioned this morning, Redgate, we have a product that will do source control as well. So I'm going to create another database. In this case, I'm going to create SimpleTalk Steve. And we're going to follow through on some of these same demos, build on them through the next few sessions as well. So in this case, it's the exact same script that I did before with a different name for the database. And so it's going to run, it's going to add tables and store procedures, create that database, and it'll exist. And if I come over here and I look at my list of databases, it'll appear. And as I said, it's exactly the same structure, exactly the same script, all the stuff that we expect to see, and then there's there. So this is SQL source control. If I actually want to make this database under source control, I have this option to link it. And you can see that over here on the right, we support Git, Mercurial, on your left, Subversion, Team Foundation Server. We actually support a folder now. You can just check out to a folder. So if you use Visual Source Safe or a centralized system that runs on a server and you have your own client where you check out to a folder and check back in, we can support that as well. In this case, I need the repository URL, so I'm going to use this one that I previously created. I grab this URL, I stick it over here, and it's going to link this database to source control. And once that's done, it's not in source control right now. If I actually go look at my repository, what I'll find is that we've added a bit of a structure here, a little more organization, something that makes sense, but there's nothing in here. But if you'll notice on this commit tab, and you'll see there's 4 tabs up here on the left, commit, get latest migrations, I have all these objects now that are uncommitted in source control, but they exist in my database. I didn't have to script anything out. We've done that for you. You can see we've got the code here. We've got the various objects listed. On the left-hand side, it says this is what's in the database. On the right-hand side, this is what's in source control, which is nothing. So I can commit this to source control. And I can say, put all this stuff in there. And when I go to my repository, and I actually refresh this now, I'll see all my stuff in source control. But what's really nice is that I don't have to change the way that I work. I don't have to train developers, that I can actually come in here and say, let me work the same way that I've been working in the past, where I want to say, I'm going to change the store procedure. And in this case, I'll get the code back eventually. I did click modify, right? Everybody see that? So it wasn't me. Let's try this again. Oh, that's so not impressive in a demo, huh? That's great. I'm going to blame John because he ran late that this stopped working. All right. There it is. If I add my parameter right here, come on, let go. Add that same parameter. I don't have to change anything because this is the alter. We expect all that stuff normally to work. Let's add our table again just because we want to do that as well. Add a table. If I come over here, you'll notice that I have a little icon to the left of the object. That tells me that I've actually made a change. If I go back to my source control tab and I refresh this, if I was waiting longer and my machine was actually working faster, this would refresh itself. But you can see I now have 2 objects to commit. In this case, you'll notice the change is highlighted that I've actually made. So without having to save anything, remember a name, I can do the same type of thing. And in my source control system, I actually find that that change is reflected. What's more important here is that if I go ahead and open this code at the head, the latest version of my source control system, anybody notice anything interesting about that script? It doesn't say alter. It says create. So at the head of your schema control, we always store the code you need to build that object from scratch. Now, if I were to move this to another database, it would in fact know that there was an existing object and it would do the alter instead rather than the create. But in the source control system, I would always store the latest version of what I need to build that object. Everybody got that? Make sense? Anybody confused? Anybody bored? Okay, good. Those of you who are developers or have done developed software should think that source control is just a natural habit. It's something you do all the time. And we haven't felt that in the database world. But developers tend to view that source control as important. that it's not something that's optional, that it's not something that's incredibly hard, that for the most part, it doesn't matter whether you have a big or small project, that you want to use source control. You want to keep track of what the versions are of your software at any point in time. Some of that is because software in general isn't temporal, that we stomp over the old version, we have a new version every time we deploy. In the database, that's not quite the same, that we actually have to keep changes across time because we can't just stomp on a database and reload it every time we want to make a change. In this case, all these quotes are essentially saying one thing, that if it's not in source control, it doesn't exist. It's not really a part of your software. And that should be a mantra that we insist on in this business, that we want to have good engineering practices and good control of the software that we build. Jeff Atwood, who did Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange, you may have heard of it, has a great quote here that your database code is just as important as your application code, and it should be treated the same way. And I would agree with that. Too often in the database world, we've kind of let the database code just, be a second-class citizen or not be as important as our application code. That's not really true. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why you use source control. I'm not going to read all these reasons, but there are a lot of benefits. And if you go through, I've got links and references in the deck and look at these. Ultimately, it kind of comes down to reducing risk, reducing the chance that you're going to make mistakes, you're going to deploy the wrong thing, that you're going to have untested code, or you're going to have code that isn't tested as well, and you're not aware of what changes are being made by one group or another group or a different developer. It's all about ensuring that we do a better job of building software. And ultimately, probably the best reason is, if you're like me, you make mistakes. Anybody here not made mistakes this year? This month? We all make mistakes. Right? Some of us are better than others. Some of us go long periods of time, but we all make mistakes. And being able to have a track of the versions, of knowing the history of what's going on, enables you to undo those mistakes very quickly. Perhaps more importantly, our job as technologists is to experiment, to try new things, to try to figure out how to solve problems in new ways. But in order to do that, when we go down a wrong path or we make a mistake, we have to be able to undo that very easily. And one of the reasons source control is used is it allows us to go backwards very quickly and undo an experiment and try a different one, find a better solution. Now, you should use something. Some of you may have used this technique. I've actually used this technique about 20 years ago. I was developing in Fox Pro, and we zipped up all our code every night and we dropped it in a folder. Some of you may have guessed on Monday we put it in the Monday folder, on Tuesday in the Tuesday folder, so on and so on. And it worked pretty well. And we didn't have to go back too often, but there were times we did have to go back. And if we ever had to go back more than a week, that was a bad day because we weren't going back more than a week. You want to use something, it doesn't matter. Please don't do it manually. So those of you that administer SQL Server instances, how many of you like clicking backup every night or typing backup database to disk? It's a bad process. You're going to fail. Ultimately, we want to use some kind of automation. We want to use some kind of tool that will help us get things done in a regular fashion, just so we don't make mistakes, because we're frail. We forget things. We get busy. We want some kind of automation, want some kind of tool that helps us out. All right, you guys believe that source control is a good idea now, version control? Anybody not believe it? Because Stephanie is back there. She's in charge of the product. She's got a hammer, so she's going to find you. Let's talk a little about standards and practices and things. So in terms of building your development process, it's important that you recognize there's a whole domain of things you have to include. It's not just your tables, not just your store procedures and functions. There's all kinds of other things that we want to include in there. If you build assemblies, if you do SQL CLR, please keep that CLR source code, the .NET, C# or VB or Python or whatever you use, keep that near your database code so that you can rebuild it if you need it. Make sure you have your security code, configuration settings. I've been a big fan for years that I love Management Studio in the GUI, but please don't ever click OK in the GUI. And what I mean is, if I want to make a change to my server, for example, I come into my properties and I want to say I'm going to make some change, I'm going to enable file stream. I don't want to click this button down here at the bottom. Right? I always want to click this button up here at the top, because what that will do is it will actually give me code. I like code. More importantly, when I screw things up, I've got a copy of the code that I just ran that made a mistake. This is the kind of thing that should go in your source control system. Probably in a separate place where it says these are all the configuration changes. And it's difficult to get developers to understand this, but this is the kind of stuff that when you make any change in Windows or anywhere else, it ought to be scripted with PowerShell or VBScript or anything you use and stored in your source control system as a change that was made for your software. I'm a big fan of that. The other thing I want to show, I have on the slide here, lookup data, right? Job data, configuration settings. Jobs, for example, you should use stored procedures or functions or something, and then in the job it only calls that object. But what about lookup data? I've got in my database one of these tables, not that table, but this table. I actually have data in here. So if we go through here, let me move my Object Explorer. I've got all this data. How do you store this in source control? Well, I could BCP this out and stick it in somewhere, right? There's a number of ways I could do it. It's kind of a pain. But one of the things that we try to make easy for Redgate in our tool is that I have the ability to link this data to source control. For example, if I pick this object and I save this, it knows that this data is an insert and has to go into there, nothing in source control. I can commit that. And it will, let me add a comment because good habits. Oops, lookup data. If I commit that and I go into my data folder and refresh it, I'll actually have all those insert statements eventually. The magic is not working today. Let's try that again. I'll have all my insert statements. All right, we'll come back in a minute. Trust me, it's coming. It'll be there. I wouldn't lie to you. I really wouldn't.
It's a 10 minutes from John.
Yeah. They made me buy a new machine. I used to have a Mac. On a Mac, it worked fantastic. On this Lenovo, not so much. So we want to include all this stuff, all this different stuff outside of just our code, but we also have to pay attention to the way we work as well. And it's important that we have some standards that are important, that we use or we distribute to everybody. Now, I'm sure most of you have a naming standard at your company. I'm just curious, how many of you that have had more than one job in the last 5 years have the same naming standard at 2 different jobs? Has anybody ever had the same naming standard at 2 different jobs? Probably you've got, if you have more than 3 developers, you have 4 naming standards inside your company. Naming standards are important. They do matter because what they do is they allow us to glean information, to glean metadata about what we're doing without having to go talk to somebody, without having to go ask questions. It is important you have some kind of naming standard, but it isn't important what it is. You can follow ISO if you would like. I don't think it matters. I don't care whether you have order headers or orders details or orders. It doesn't matter. Just do something and make it lightweight. Please don't try to build standards that cover every single contingency. Most of us that are in technology, we tend to be a little bit anal or OCD. We want things to work all the time, every way. Please don't do that, okay? If you don't build CLR assemblies, don't make a standard for CLR assemblies. It's just dumb. It's a waste of your time. Make very lightweight standards that are easy for people to understand, that are guidelines. If you can't explain it to the new developer, the new gal or guy that starts, in 10 minutes, it's too heavyweight. Make it simple. All right? Make it just in time. If you come up with a new area, you start building CLR code, make a standard then. It doesn't matter. You have it in place ahead of time. Use what you need. Document these very, very lightly. But most importantly, use some kind of tool. Use something that helps you enforce the standard. If you don't want procedures named SP underscore, don't yell at every developer when they do it. Build some tool that checks and send somebody a note, or that checks before they check it in the source control or to deploy it somewhere else that says we don't allow this. Okay? Use tools as much as possible. Automation is the key to many of these things. Probably some of you have different styles as well at your companies. Some of you like commas after the column name, right? You guys are wrong, so you know. Commas should be before the column name. You're not wrong. We would disagree on that point. I think style standards, though, are somewhat stupid because these days we have modern tools and modern IDEs that can do this stuff for you. It doesn't make any sense for you to try to enforce some standard that's going to annoy half of your developers or half of your DBAs because they are just used to working a different way. And ultimately, what we're going to do is just use tools. Now, at Redgate, we make SQL prompt. At other companies, there's other things as well. Oh, that's so bad. Why isn't that there? All right, last time. I quit. Stephanie, this is your fault. It's actually not your fault because my whole thing is slow today. Man, all right. So let's imagine that I pick a store procedure and I want to edit it, and it will edit, please. Is my debugger running? Eventually, we're going to get there. All right, everybody, on 1, 2, 3, abracadabra. Oh, this is so bad. See, this doesn't happen on Macs. Let's try this again. All right, so how many of you like things formatted like this? Probably not many of you. It's kind of annoying. It's hard to read for me. Imagine this is 100 lines of code. If this ever comes back to life, we will, in fact, do something. So much for my demos. All right, we'll go back to it. But SQL Prompt will reformat things for you. SQL SMS Tool Pack will. There are other tools as well. Those of you that probably have worked in the Visual Studio world know that there are plugins and add-ins there as well that will actually reformat code for you. It should be really easy to buy these tools, and if nothing else, they save developers time. Somebody checks out a piece of code or they open up a piece of code that they're not familiar with. They just click reformat, and it gets reformatted according to the style that they like, that they're used to understanding. SQL Server Central, we constantly see people complaining about somebody's posting code in a way they can't understand. It's not easy to read. It's, everything's on a line. It's so nice in your own environment just to be able to reformat it and not argue about those things any longer. And we shouldn't. These days in modern tools, we just shouldn't do that. Last thing we're talking about is process standards now. This is the way you work. And these are probably the most important thing to work in a team to ensure that everything flows smoothly. K. Scott Allen is a developer, and he wrote a great series on his ode to code.com about developing in a database as well as developing software. And he says in a database, he really came up with these 3 rules for how you put things together. And it's probably the best set of rules I've seen for database development in the last 20 years. And first, they say never use a shared database. And I'm not going to ask who uses a shared database. Probably some of you do. It's a bad idea. These days with virtual machines, hardware is cheap. Disk is cheap. You can buy a terabyte of disk for under 100 pounds. You certainly can buy it for under $100. There's no reason to not have shared or to not have dedicated databases for every single developer. You may have a shared database for development where you integrate things together, but each developer ought to be able to play. If I need to change the schema of a table to experiment to see if a new feature will work, or I need to add a store procedure or change something, I shouldn't cause development to halt for anybody else because I made a mistake. There's no reason to have a shared environment anymore. All right? It doesn't even cost you anything for the software to stick up a SQL server, right? You can use Express. If you have a deal with Microsoft, it's $50 or it's free for Developer Edition. You should always have a separate place for each developer to just play. Along with that, you want to make sure that you always have an authoritative source for your schema. You want to make sure that at any point in time you can build up that schema for that database without a problem. And that's typically going to be source control, that it gives you a place to go where you can be sure that you have an actual schema. And then lastly, you want to have versions. Probably some of you that have deployed software and you've made a mistake, you have to patch it, right? But you're not sitting around waiting for somebody to tell you that software broke. You've continued onward and you're working on the next version of your software at the same time. You have to be able to go backwards in your main line and say, we deployed this version, we now need to patch it, so I need to be able to work with that version of the software. Source control allows me to do that, or version control allows me to do that. The best way to do this, again, I can't say always use version control, but commit often. Make sure that you commit regularly. Whenever you finish something, you finish an object, you think it's going to work, commit it. It doesn't matter. If it doesn't work, we can get rid of it. We can roll backwards, we can undo the change. All of that stuff happens if I'm using source control. You want to make sure that you are using automation as much as possible. Use tools. All right. I know a lot of you struggle to get a budget for tools, and not every tool is a good return on investment. But tools really make a huge difference. Often your salary is the #1 cost in building software. And if you look at it like that, spending $100, $200, $500, $1,000 on tools that can reduce the amount of time you spend doing busy work is a huge investment. All right? Evaluate tools, pick the ones that work well for your environment, but please use tools. And then train your people. It doesn't take a lot of training, but train people. As you get new people, please explain to them how to use tools and answer their questions, be open and inviting, teach them how to use your process. Okay? It's just not that big a deal. And then build often is the last one to talk about, because ultimately we want to get to this holy grail of being able to continuously build our software at any point in time. It sounded crazy when I first heard it, but today is June 21st. It's the 200th day of the year, roughly. We've probably deployed software from Redgate to customers over 200 times this year. We don't have 200 products, right? 20 some products. But we have the ability to deploy often. The reason we can deploy often is because we build often. We don't have stuff that sits in inventory. We don't wait 2 years to go from SQL Server 2012 to 2014. We deploy changes on a more regular basis. They don't, you guys get the option to sometimes turn them on or off or not use them, but we've gone to this point where we try to deploy very often. In the next session after this one, David will talk about continuous integration, which is really that holy grail of being able to, every time somebody makes change, have builds occur in an automated way that check to see that the build actually continues to work. Nothing is broken. All right, let's everybody cross your fingers. Let's see if this actually works. Look at that. Something worked. I'm going to restart this, I think, because it doesn't like me for some reason. I'm not saving anything. All right. I think this is my Hyper-V smash job. How many use Hyper-V? Few. How many use VMware? How many of you don't know what a virtual machine is? Okay, I'm just curious. I know you're not going to answer that question. The Hyper-V thing is really, anybody here from Microsoft? Out of curiosity? Okay. I'm just wondering if I'm going to lose my MVP today, so the Hyper-V thing is just a piece of crap, I think. That's just me speaking. It does not represent the views of Redgate or Microsoft or anybody else. So, let me just show this real quick, because some of you probably haven't seen it. Let's just modify this real quick. Okay, real quick. It's going to work real quick. Look at that. I can reformat this. Some of you probably do this all the time because your coworkers make you insane. I have all these options as well, so if I were to go into here and I said, you know, for example, for me, this is the incorrect default. John, by the way, this should be the default all the time, but fortunately SQL prompt just lets me do whatever I want to do. So let me create a new database. I made this little snippet thanks to David. It was his idea. I can, let's do Grant, because I work with Grant, and while he's slightly annoying and he puts commas at the end of things, you know, he's a good guy overall. So I've created this new database over here, which we'll see here. Grant has to work on the same project that I work on. We both work on SimpleTalk. Not really, Tony won't let us, but we could work on SimpleTalk together. So if I wanted to make sure that Grant could get set up very easily, I could actually go back to this spot, send him this URL. First day, Grant gets a new machine. He has to give up his Mac as well. He can go ahead and link his database to source control. And then he has an empty database. He doesn't have anything there, but he can actually go through here and get all the code, all the items that are in source control. And you can see here source control, here's his database. So with sticking in that one URL in just a minute, that he can actually come through here, and Grant has a database, could be on a separate machine, you know, it could be another side of the world, that's got data in there. And maybe most importantly, it's actually got lookup data in there as well. So anything that's in source control is automatically pushed through. All right? More importantly, if Grant actually makes a change to something, let's say he wants to change his table, and I'm in the GUI and he wants to say, add something else in there. I can go over here and he'll actually find there's a, what did I say, company there? He can put those changes in source control. They'll appear in there, and if I want to get them back, once an hour or something, I can actually look and I'll find those changes appearing on my system. If I let the polling occur, it'll actually let me know that there's changes that have been made. No reason to use a shared database in this kind of model ever for any type of development work. Makes it really easy to go through there. Any of you work alone, out of curiosity? A few of you. It's kind of nice not working with anybody else, right? Only one guy to blame then when you make mistakes, this is how I work typically. But teamwork is important, especially as we try to build software at any kind of scale or at any kind of speed. We got to make sure that we work together. And there's really three things here, because the rule of threes ensures you're going to remember this, that are important in a team. We have to communicate with each other. Now, communication doesn't mean that we send an email to the team every time we make a change. You probably have coworkers like that. It's incredibly annoying. But when I need to know if there's a change, when I'm working along and I want to be notified that something has been altered or added or something else, I want to be able to get that information just in time. Using a tool like source control, some other type of tool that coordinates people together, allows that communication to occur without the overhead of everybody being told about every change, or meaning we have to have multiple stand-up meetings or long stand-up meetings every day. Communication is important, but we want to make it lightweight. We also want to coordinate. We want to make sure that those changes, those things do flow very quickly back and forth between people so that everybody is kind of working with the latest version of things all the time. That means if we're in a dedicated environment, we have multiple databases, we have to make those changes flow back and forth. If we get to the continuous integration environment, we have to make sure all those changes flow into one place on a regular basis. Again, automation and tools is the way to do that. And then lastly, you need critiques. Probably some of you have written comments or seen comments in code that made you kind of go, or something else. Rather than doing that, you should have a way that you can critique people and say, that didn't really help me understand what the change was. Or that comment is obvious and redundant. It doesn't help me in this code. But maybe most importantly, we want positive comments. If I stood up here, or let's say Grant, because Grant does the query tuning stuff, and he presented 10 examples of how not to write a query, is that better than if he gave you one example of how to write a query? You want a positive comment. Please, when somebody does something well, tell them, hey, that helped me. That was really good. That will go a long way towards building teamwork and meshing your developers together, building that bonds. Use those positive comments and critiques as often as you can. And for some of you that are managers, use them more. As hard as it is to deal with a manager that yells at you, it's almost harder if you find a manager that never gives you positive feedback. So John, I can see you. Give positive feedback often. It makes a big difference. All right. Again, automation, use your IDEs as much as possible to do work for you. Find those plugins. There's millions of free tools and plugins that will help you do better or work better. So please find them, but also consider a tool. Redgate makes tools, other companies make tools. Using those tools will actually help you develop better. So let's look just a little more about flow in teams and other things that are handy. So Grant made his change. I got it on my system now, so I can see it. It's in source control. We know it's there. Let me open up another script here. So for those of you that stick around for the next session, David's going to talk about continuous integration, and I'm almost out of time. David, I apologize. This is David's script, which David lives in Germany. He's kind of slack. He doesn't. This is David's script. Oh man, this is so horrible. All right. I'm gonna pray that this works. The script isn't coming up. So, how many of you use test-driven development or write tests for your code? Not enough of you. That's the most immature part of this industry is we suck at testing stuff. We suck, absolutely suck. So this is SQL Test. We built this product and it's built on what's called the T-SQL-T framework, which is a framework for actually building tests, and you should use it. In this case, you'll notice I mentioned SQL Cop earlier in terms of checking for standards. We include a number of tests here where this will actually go through and check your code and let you know if you adhere to these various items. Are you gonna try to fix me? This is David, by the way, he's gonna talk next.
I was just going to suggest opening it in Notepad and then copying and pasting it into Management Studio.
It's a developer says Notepad. That would be something I would normally do, I think. I don't know why that's not working, but let's do. Oh, so David actually did do some work, by the way, so you guys are wondering. See, developers are really handy. They're smart guys. I want to show you a test, actually. So I've got all these databases. I know this can be a little bit hard to read if this actually works. But all these tests allow me to actually see what's going on in my database. Come on. And if this actually worked, what I would do is run a test, and I would show you that I would actually pass a test, and then I would fail a test, and I would pass a test, and but I don't know if that's going to happen today. This isn't a Redgate product, by the way. This is my Hyper-V system that's not working. But let me just walk you through this. Here, roughly, is the code for writing a test. It looks a little bit complex, but it's not that hard to get used to. In this case, you kind of create a fake instance before I would actually write a stored procedure. I would write this test. And what this would do is check to see that if I ran this particular stored procedure, it would actually add data to a table. And in this case, I create this test, and if I run this test, it will actually fail because I haven't created a stored procedure yet. Then what I would do is I would scroll down here further and I would create the stored procedure. And there's nothing magic about the stored procedure. It's the kind of stored procedure you guys probably write all the time. But once I create this stored procedure, I actually have the ability to insert data into a table then with this stored procedure, and then my test would pass. And that's the idea of trying to do test-driven development, where I write a test, I write code, that should work, and my test should then pass. And more importantly is that these tests are just stored procedures, so I can put them in source control. And if I put them in source control and I use a tool, then I can easily share them with the rest of my team. So in that way, we don't have one person responsible for all the testing that may or may not understand all the code. But we have shared the load, and all developers have the ability to write tests and share them, and everybody gets the benefit then of a more complete testing framework for your application, which is important because, as I said, we were really immature here. And apparently Hyper-V is a little immature as well because it's not working. But never fear, David will show some of this in the next session as well, right? You can show SQL Test.
It works.
It works. It does work. It actually has worked regularly for me until today. But so I'm out of time because I was running late, and Annabelle's going to yell at me in a minute. But hopefully I've made a case to you that version control is really, really important. And it really is the key to working in a team efficiently and effectively and with fewer mistakes. It really is about reducing risk and making sure that you build higher quality software. We have a bad enough reputation in the rest of the world as it is for the software that we deploy and build. We should be trying to do better. And whether you choose to use Redgate tools or somebody else's tools, you should be using tools and automation and other ways to actually pull your team together and work in a more efficient manner. As I said, David's going to talk here in just a moment about continuous integration. For those of you that haven't used it or seen it, it's a fantastic method of improving the efficiency of not only your development, but also your organization as well. You know, we've released hundreds of times this year at Redgate. Last year, I think we released 1,000 times across all of our products. which is pretty impressive when you think about 20 or 30 products that we released software 1,000 times last year. And it wasn't patches and bugs. It was a lot of improvements to software. Please fill out your feedback both for this session and the evaluation. Hopefully you guys are going to have a great day and learn something. Please feel free to ask any questions or grab any of us. I'll take questions.
But it doesn't open with it.
I think out front, if you really have a question, or just find me later today, but I want to get off stage so David can get going. So thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed this.
Yes. I've just switched it on so that.